Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 tier listing guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today, in my ongoing look at Baldur's Gate 3 itemization, we're covering boots. So it's the other feet tier list that you've all been clamoring for. Get it? Clamoring? Get it? Anyways. Boots, I think, are one of the hardest slots in the game to itemize correctly, and most interesting, because rather than giving you just raw stats like a lot of other items, boots primarily provide utility. That means that different characters are going to want very different boots, rather than there just being a few that are best in slot for every character. Boots and which ones you want will depend very heavily on what you're trying to accomplish with that character. So there's fewer that are just, this gives you a pile of stats, so everyone should wear it, and more that are interesting for specific strategies, meaning you have a lot more decision-making and choice when it comes to which boots to equip. I think for that reason it's probably the best designed item slot overall. There are 5, 10, 15, 30, 37 sets of boots in the game, which is more than most other item slots, so I'm going to try to get through these in one video, but if the video ends up running long, then I may divide them into two. Just as with my other item series, we are going to be rating these items as to how strong they are at the point in the game in which you find them, because it doesn't make sense to directly compare an Act 1 item to an Act 3 item. That means that as we go through the tiers, items to the right will generally be stronger in terms of absolute power level, because they show up later on in the game. In S tier, I'm placing items that are best in slot for a wide variety of characters or specific very powerful characters. In A tier, items that make interesting alternatives to the S tier items and can be used for certain strategies. In B tier, items that enable specific builds or are useful for certain encounters, that kind of thing. And in C tier, items that have niche or very marginal uses. Usually they're going to be worse than the items in higher tiers, but do maybe enable a strategic option that you wouldn't have otherwise. And then in D tier, items that most parties can simply ignore, or you can just feed them to Gale. Alright, without any further ado, let's start talking boots. We'll begin with an easy one, the non-magical leather boots. These are just normal boots. They presumably keep your feet warm and dry, but in-game have no actual mechanical benefit, so we can safely ignore them. D tier. The non-magical metallic boots require medium armor proficiency and give you +1 to your athletics. Technically this is a bonus. +1 to your athletics can make you better at shoving or resisting being shoved, and so you might wear these over the normal leather boots if you happen to find them before you get any other boots, but this bonus is so tiny that it's safe to ignore. D tier for these as well. Next up, the first real boots, the boots of aid and comfort. These give you, whenever you heal a target, that target also gains 3 temporary hit points, so they get whatever healing you're giving them normally, and then 3 temp HP on top of that. Temp HP doesn't stack, so this won't work on characters that have sources of larger amounts of temporary HP. It won't be particularly useful for them. But for any character that doesn't have another source of temp HP, +3 HP is not terrible. This can work on your whole party if you equip these boots and then throw a potion at the ground to heal your entire party, so you can have the bonus hit points before you go into combat. The obvious combination here is with the other buff on heal items, the Hellrider's Pride and the Whispering Promise, and with those 3 items together equipped, then somebody that you heal gains Bless, Blade Ward, and 3 temporary hit points, and because you have damage resistance from Blade Ward, under most circumstances, those 3 temporary hit points will require 6 damage to actually get through, since you'll be taking half damage from physical attacks. So the Boots of Aid and Comfort are the weakest of those 3 items, but still a useful combination with those 3 items. Because you can get these relatively early in the game, and because they are a part of a very powerful strategy, the Boots of Aid and Comfort are going to see play in most parties in the game. Even if you don't have a dedicated healer, then any character can benefit from having these equipped, because you can throw potions at your allies to stack up temporary hit points before you go into combat. The Boots of Aid and Comfort, therefore, I'm going to place in S tier. They're very good. You get them very early, so there aren't a lot of other options. You might want to swap them out for other boots on some characters later on, but at the point in which you probably acquire them, the Boots of Aid and Comfort are excellent, and for many parties they stay relevant long throughout Act 1 and even on into later acts. 3 temporary hit points doesn't sound like much, of course, but if it makes the difference between living and dying, then obviously it has done its job. And because it is so free to get this buff over and over and over again, it's just very powerful. The boots of aid and comfort are very much worth equipping in the early game. The boots of elemental momentum. These require medium armor proficiency and give you, whenever you deal elemental damage with a spell, so acid, cold, fire, lightning, or thunder damage, whenever you deal that kind of damage with a spell, you gain momentum for 2 turns. Momentum gives you plus 5 feet of movement per turn remaining to a maximum of 5, so basically when you use a damaging elemental spell, you gain an additional 10 feet of movement that turn, 5 feet of movement the turn after. If you keep using those spells, then you can move much faster around the battlefield. Momentum's a pretty powerful effect, because mobility is just very good, of course, in Baldur's Gate 3, but this is a relatively restrictive item because it requires you to have medium armor proficiency and cast spells. So you're only going to be able to use it to trigger the benefit if you are a Tempest Cleric or a Druid or a multi-classed character who has medium armor proficiency to wear them, or a Githyanki, I guess, or Dwarf. Because normally a wizard or sorcerer won't be able to actually wear the boots of elemental momentum, and those are the characters most likely to be doing elemental damage with their spells. For a character that can use these, they're not bad. Additional mobility, of course, is very good, though it does require you, to get the maximum benefit out of it, you have to start with a damaging spell. You have to begin the encounter by casting a damaging spell, and a lot of the time that's not what you want to do with your first spell in an encounter. But if you have a character who's spec'd around doing that kind of damage, like a Fire Sorcerer, or Tempest Cleric, or the Lightning Lord build, then the Boots of Elemental Momentum can give them some extra speed. Even for those characters, though, there are better mobility options and better defensive options for casters, so I'm going to place these in B tier because I do like the effect. Going faster is, of course, really good. Momentum remains a very powerful effect, but it's relatively restrictive as to who can actually use these boots, and for many of those characters, there are overall better options, I think. The Boots of Genial Striding. Not to be confused with the Boots of Striding, this is their much happier cousin. The Boots of Genial Striding make you immune to being slowed by difficult terrain. They don't make you immune to the other effects of difficult terrain. Some effects that give you immunity to difficult terrain make you immune to, like, the damage that a spike growth deals, for example, and the Boots of Genial Striding don't do that. They make you immune to being slowed by difficult terrain, most notably plant growth, which does count as difficult terrain, so if you cast plant growth, you can walk through this. You could maybe build a strategy around this, and it will come up in some combat arenas where you can get through difficult terrain, but because of Baldur's Gate's bonus action jump, difficult terrain is much less impactful in Baldur's Gate than it is in tabletop Dungeons & Dragons or other D&D video games, so the Boots of Genial Striding mostly won't come up unless you specifically build around having your character move through plant growth, and if you want to do that, there are better ways to acquire this ability. In general, I don't think that the Boots of Genial Striding are worth building around, even if that was something that you wanted to do. And so I'm going to say that these are D tier. Difficult terrain immunity just is not an exciting feature in a game that makes it so easy to avoid entering or having to deal with difficult terrain. The Boots of Speed. The Boots of Speed let you spend your bonus action to double your movement speed that round. It's basically letting you dash as a bonus action, like a rogue or a monk can do, although importantly it's not actually a dash, so it won't trigger the effects that trigger on dash. So you can't gain temporary hit points with a Stallion Barbarian with the Boots of Speed, for example, but you can spend your bonus action to double your movement speed. This is quite a lot of additional mobility for a large number of characters. That being said, this is a little less valuable than I think it sounds, because it's competing with a bunch of other item slots that duplicate the effect in interesting ways, or just the basic jump action available to every character. Many characters can gain additional mobility through jumping, and so don't really need the bonus action dash effect in Baldur's Gate. If jump wasn't a bonus action in BG3, then the Boots of Speed would be more appealing. And, of course, the Disintegrating Nightwalkers let you Misty Step, which overall is better. Nevertheless, the Boots of Speed are still a very powerful mobility tool. For any character that doesn't have a great use for its bonus action, you can get up into enemies' business much quicker when you have the Boots of Speed available. You can also run away more easily, and it's not limited in any way other than just being able to use it only once per turn. So you can bonus action dash throughout any combat that you want to be in. The Boots of Speed give you a ton of additional mobility as a result. Some characters will have items that duplicate this effect better, or some characters will have abilities that let them duplicate this effect, including strength characters who can jump to a similar extent, but many characters will benefit from the incredible mobility boost that the Boots of Speed give you. It makes your positioning easier. It also makes it really easy to get out of a losing combat, which is an important thing for Honor Mode to have in your back pocket if things start to go south. Being able to spend your bonus action to dash. You can also dash and Boots of Speed in the same turn, so you can gain triple your movement speed if you spend your action and bonus action. The Boots of Speed will just let you run really far away so you can disengage from a losing combat. Mobility in Baldur's Gate is excellent, so even though the Boots of Speed are held back a little bit by the core mechanics of the game, and by the existence of the Disintegrating Nightwalkers, you get them before those, and I think it is very rare that a party won't want these somewhere in their party. If you have all high-strength characters and rogues, then you might not have a party member that wants these, but someone's going to want the Boots of Speed. S tier. The Boots of Stormy Clamour. The Boots of Stormy Clamour give you, whenever you inflict a condition on an enemy, they also gain 2 turns of Reverberation. Reverberation reduces enemies' physical saving throws, strength, dex, and con, by 1 per stack, and at 5 stacks they have to make a DC 10 con save or they fall prone. Prone, obviously, a very powerful effect in Baldur's Gate 3, and while a DC 10 con save doesn't sound like it's going to be difficult for enemies to pass, remember that by the time they're hitting 5 stacks, they're taking a -5 penalty on this saving throw, so they're going to fall prone a decent amount of the time when they hit 5 stacks from the Boots of Stormy Clamour. The number of ways to apply this are immense. Many effects in the game apply conditions, and you get 2 turns of Reverberation for free. Some builds will do this better than others, most notably Radiating Orb Clerics can stack this up almost immediately using just the Boots of Stormy Clamour. Tiger Heart Barbarians with their AoE swing can do this, and then enemies will also be taking disadvantage on the con save because they'll be bleeding from the Tiger Heart bleed, and so get knocked prone, and then they might get maimed and be unable to get back up again. The Boots of Stormy Clamour just apply very easily and have a very powerful effect. Reverberation, I think, is second only to, I guess third after Arcane Acuity and Radiating Orb in terms of broken item mechanics, and the Boots of Stormy Clamour are the best way to apply it, so they're going straight into S tier. There's so many builds based around this item, but you can also just throw them onto anyone for a pretty powerful bonus to your party, because most characters will apply some form of condition at some point. I've talked extensively in my other item tier lists about how good Reverberation is, and the Boots of Stormy Clamour are the best way to do it, so S tier. The Boots of Striding. The Boots of Striding require medium armor proficiency, and give you, whenever you cast a concentration spell, you gain 1 turn of momentum, which is, obviously 1 turn of momentum is worse than the 2 turns of momentum that the Boots of Elemental Momentum apply, but you'll almost certainly get it on the turn when it actually matters, because most spellcasters want to cast a concentration spell on the first turn of combat. Not everybody leads off combat with a damaging spell. In fact, often damaging spells are used in later turns primarily, whereas most spellcasters are going to lead with a concentration spell, so you'll get the mobility boost when it matters. The real star of the Boots of Striding, though, is that while you are concentrating on a spell, you can't be knocked prone or pushed. So enemies can't push you, including off of cliffs, and you can't be knocked prone. In Baldur's Gate 3, if a character is knocked prone, they immediately lose concentration on whatever spell they were concentrating on without a saving throw. This can be the only way for some characters to lose concentration. If you have, like, Warcaster and are spec'd heavily into con saves, maybe you're a halfling, you won't fail concentration saves, but if you get knocked prone, you just immediately lose it without a die roll at all. The Boots of Striding totally prevent that fail case, which is really nice for characters that want to concentrate on spells in combat, and of course, since this is a medium armor caster set, it's geared at druids and clerics, who will almost always be concentrating on a spell. The Boots of Striding give you a lot of safety. Now, they are a purely defensive item, which, generally speaking, I prefer items that give you more offensive capabilities or mobility options, so let you take out enemies faster, rather than have to endure what they do for you. And it's worth noting with the Boots of Striding that they are better for less experienced players in general. They're more powerful, I think, the less experienced the player you are. Because one of the best uses for them is to stop you from accidentally walking on your own grease or ice surfaces, falling over, losing concentration on haste, stunning your party members, and having the entire fight spiral out of control from there. Something which you and I, of course, would never do because we're tactical geniuses who've never misclicked in our lives, but for lesser players could definitely be a concern. The Boots of Striding prevent that issue, but as you get more and more comfortable with the game, that becomes less of a challenge for at least some of the time. And so mostly you're worried about getting knocked prone by enemy effects, which there actually aren't that many effects in the game that enemies apply that knock you prone. One of the easiest ways to get knocked prone is by doing it to yourself. The Boots of Striding, therefore, are very, very good for casters that want to maintain concentration on spells, but there are other options, and often I prefer the mobility options for those characters, so I'm going to give them A tier, but I think these are always worth looking at, especially if you find yourself losing concentration on spells due to getting knocked over, and especially for fights where the enemies have ways to knock you prone. The Cinder Shoes. The Cinder Shoes give you 2 turns of heat whenever you burn an enemy. Now, this isn't dealing fire damage to an enemy, this is actually burning them by lighting them on fire with the burning condition. And when you do that, you get 2 turns of heat, which you can then discharge to improve your later fire damage. The easiest way to apply burning to enemies is, there's a couple items that do it, weapons that will allow you to do it, but the easiest way for most characters is probably Alchemist's Fire or Arrows of Fire. And for a build centered around those items, the Cinder Shoes actually can increase your damage somewhat significantly. Now, it's a pretty rare character that's centered around Alchemist's Fire or Arrows of Fire, though I do have guides to those kinds of characters, and for them, the Cinder Shoes for my Grenadier build or my Arcane Archer build, the Cinder Shoes are actually pretty interesting. But heat also is not that powerful a mechanic. You need to build it up and then discharge it with an AoE, and it does 1 extra damage per stack of heat. I think, best use for these items is if you're throwing a bunch of Alchemist Fire, then the later ones you can discharge the heat to do additional AoE damage, and that's a very early game thing. I think there's probably something cool that you can do there, so I'm going to give the Cinder Shoes C tier, though I think unless you are really very specifically building around triggering this item, it's pretty safe to ignore it. The Disintegrating Nightwalkers. The Disintegrating Nightwalkers let you cast Misty Step once per short rest, and make you immune to becoming enwebbed, entangled, or ensnared by Ensnaring Strike, the Entangle spell, and similar things, and Web from spiders, and you also can't slip on grease or ice. So they provide you with most of the best benefits of the Boots of Striding, and also give you Misty Step once per short rest. Once per short rest Misty Step is often as much as you need it, because it's usually either a panic button or to get to a location that you couldn't otherwise reach. Misty Step, of course, is the best mobility tool in the game, and every character should strive to have access to it, whether as a spell or from an item, so the Disintegrating Nightwalkers provide something that you're very much looking for. The immunity to all of those various effects is, of course, excellent as well, especially for characters who have ways to apply that themselves, and the Disintegrating Nightwalkers just give you everything that you want from a set of boots in a single package. I think this might be my single most equipped item in the game. I'm trying to think if there's another item that I've used more than the Disintegrating Nightwalkers, but I think basically, every party that I have played has had this equipped for 100% of the time that it has been available to that party. I can't think of any party that doesn't want the Disintegrating Nightwalkers. So obviously it's going into S tier. These are probably the best boots in the game and will stay relevant all the way until the very end of the game. The Hoarfrost Boots. They're actually called the Hoarfrost Boots. I wrote shoes here, but boots is correct. The Hoarfrost Boots give you can't fall prone while walking on icy terrain. So they're similar to the Disintegrating Nightwalkers or the Boots of Striding. They provide you some of the effect of each of them, but obviously not some of the best benefits. They are passive and don't require you to be concentrating on a spell, so for characters that aren't spellcasters, they're more useful for not falling prone than the Boots of Striding, but they also don't prevent enemies from knocking you prone, so the effect is much less. You would only use the Hoarfrost Boots if you are building around this effect, if you're doing some kind of ice surface party, where you intend to be just on ice all the time, or you intend to use like the Snowburst Ring alongside melee attacks, then the Hoarfrost Boots could come up. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't use them. That's a reasonably powerful strategy, and making your whole party immune to ice is not a bad idea if you are using a lot of ice surfaces, so I'm going to give them B tier, but obviously they are the least of these three options, and so only use them if you already have the Striding Boots and Nightwalkers equipped and still want a third copy of this effect. The Linebreaker Boots. The Linebreaker Boots give you, whenever you dash, in combat, you gain 3 turns of Wrath. Wrath gives you +1 damage to your attacks, your melee attacks, per stack remaining, so when you get this, you get +3 damage to all of your attacks, then it can stack up further, up to a maximum of +7. You can only use this effect during combat, so you can't dash a bunch before entering combat to stack it up. So mostly you're going to be using this on characters that have a way to dash as a bonus action in order to gain the benefits of the Linebreaker Boots without having to waste their action. So rogues and monks can benefit from this effect. It only works with melee weapons, so primarily this is going to be dagger rogues or weapon monks who can use the Linebreaker Boots, and it will in general be less damage to activate Wrath than it is to make an offhand attack. So if you have the ability to make bonus action attacks with this character, the Linebreaker Boots won't do anything. However, there's a couple characters that can benefit very strongly from the Linebreaker Boots. Most notably, dagger rogues can still benefit because sometimes you're going to bonus action dash anyways, and you just need that dash to get into melee range. Having 3 extra damage on your attacks that round is going to be great. And also, Stallion Barbarians, who take levels in Rogue to gain the bonus action dash, can use this to gain the temporary hit points from the Stallion Animal Heart aspect, and then also get 3 turns of additional damage. The Linebreaker Boots, therefore, are pretty powerful for a bunch of builds. Wrath is a very good effect, and for characters that can trigger the Linebreaker Boots easily, the additional damage will definitely be very welcome. This is usable by a relatively narrow subset of characters because you do have to have a way to bonus action dash to make the Linebreaker Boots work, but for the characters that it's useful for, these are very good. A tier. The Mystra's Grace. These give you Featherfall, usable at will. Now, most parties will have access to Featherfall if they can cast it at all. It's a ritual spell, so you don't need to spend spell slots on casting it out of combat. Being able to cast it as a bonus action during combat without spending a spell slot is not totally irrelevant, and if you don't have access to Featherfall from other sources, the Mystra's Grace can be very good. Most parties will either not need this or have it from elsewhere, but if you want Featherfall, the Mystra's Grace are pretty good to have around, so you can swap them in for out-of-combat mobility and whatever. I'm going to put them in C tier because Featherfall scrolls and stuff are so easily duplicated, but this is one way to do that. The Spiderstep Boots. These make you immune to being enwebbed, so you can't be hit by the web spell, and your movement speed isn't slowed by moving on web surfaces. Now obviously this is going to depend very heavily on the dungeon and the encounter as to whether these boots are useful at all, whether enemies are casting web or whether there's web surfaces around, but luckily you get them right before one of the only encounters in the game where this effect comes up. So you might wear them for that encounter and then swap them out later, but it's still a pretty marginal effect. I'll give them C tier just because you might use them for one encounter. The Springstep Boots. These give you, whenever you dash, you gain 3 turns of momentum for a bonus 15 feet of movement speed. This only works in combat, just like the Linebreaker Boots, so you gain 3 turns of momentum instead of 3 turns of Wrath. Most characters with bonus action dashes are going to want 3 turns of Wrath more than they want 3 turns of Momentum. Obviously, 15 feet of movement speed is pretty good, and the Springstep Boots do give you additional mobility, but on the turns where you're dashing, you probably don't need that much additional mobility anyways, because you're already doubling your movement speed. The 3 turns of momentum apply after the dash application, so you only get plus 15 feet of movement speed, not plus 30 feet from the Springstep Boots. And in general, I think if you're already going 60 or 80 feet in a round, then you don't really need the momentum effect from the Springstep Boots. I can see wanting these if you have a character that really wants to move around a lot in combat, or for particularly large arenas where you need to traverse them very quickly for some reason. But for the most part, if you want this effect on a dash, then you would rather have the more offensive effects from the Linebreaker Boots or the Speedy Lightfeet rather than the Springstep Boots. I'll give them B tier because momentum is still a pretty good effect. The Swiresy Shoes. These give you +1 to your acrobatics, which is a tiny bonus that you can pretty safely ignore. Obviously, you'll take it because it's free, but you're not excited about it. And increase your jump distance by 5 feet. This could be a pretty significant portion of your jump distance if you're a low-strength character, so it can let them traverse otherwise impassable areas. Maybe you are hopping from rock to rock, and your characters don't jump far enough. The Swiresy Shoes can help fix that. Or for characters with long jump distances, this could give you even more. The jump distance does get tripled by the jump spell, or enhanced leap spell, so you can gain quite a bit of additional benefit if you're using enhanced leap. But the real problem with the Swiresy Shoes is that they're a mobility tool that require you to jump, which is already improving your mobility for most characters. So they kind of double down on something that you've got enough of if you're spending your bonus action on jumping. For characters that really want to jump long distances, the Swiresy Shoes can be pretty interesting, or have free action jumps like Monk's Step of the Wind. This can improve your mobility. And it is an improvement to your mobility that's totally passive. It doesn't require you to do anything like dash or cast Misty Step. So the Swiresy Shoes do have some applications. And if you are casting Enhanced Leap on your whole party regularly before entering combat, then the amount of bonus mobility you get from these is pretty significant. This is a very small bonus, and I think most parties will not want the Swiresy Shoes, but because you can get 15 feet of bonus movement speed from it if you're jumping regularly every turn of combat and using Enhanced Leap, I'll give it C tier, but I think you can, again, fairly safely ignore the Swiresy Shoes for most characters. The Speedy Lightfeet. These require medium armor proficiency and give you, whenever you dash, you gain 3 lightning charges. Lightning charges give you +1 to hit and +1 lightning damage, and that's just 1 total, it's not per charge. And then you also gain an additional D8 lightning damage on your next attack if you hit 5 stacks of lightning charges. Overall, most characters that want this effect, if they are dashing and trying to increase their damage, are going to want the Linebreaker Boots for the bonus Wrath more than they want the lightning charges. And characters that specifically want to build lightning charges are going to have an easier time doing it with the Watersparkers rather than the Speedy Lightfeet in most circumstances. So, both halves of these boots, I think, are just superseded by other items that do it better. However, there's a couple use cases for the Speedy Lightfeet. If you are, lightning charges work on ranged attacks, so if you're dashing around, you gain the benefits from ranged attacks with your lightning charges, and obviously that's very good. Wrath doesn't work on ranged attacks. If you have a specific need for lightning charges, because you're doing some kind of lightning charge build, then these can be very helpful for a character that is using them. And on Tactician mode or below especially, but even on Honor mode, lightning charges have a lot of damage rider bugs and can often apply the damage from the lightning charges many more times than they're supposed to, or allow you to apply other damage riders multiple times over, so you can use these items to generate a lot of buggy additional damage. For a character who wants the bonus action dash damage of the Linebreaker Boots, but is using ranged weapons or thrown weapons, the Speedy Lightfeet are pretty good. Overall, though, I think most characters are going to want either the Watersparkers or the Linebreaker Boots rather than this effect, so I'll give them B tier. Varsh Boots. I had to move the Watersparkers because I got the alphabet wrong, so we'll come back to those in a second. Varsh Boots give you, you are immune to acid surfaces, so you won't take the -2 armor class when you're on an acid surface, and you're resistant to acid damage. Acid damage is pretty uncommon in Baldur's Gate, but gaining acid resistance is also somewhat difficult. So Varsh Boots give you resistance to a relatively uncommon damage type in a relatively free way. So if you're going into an encounter that has a lot of acid damage, then you could swap those in order to gain the benefits there. Now, you probably have elixirs of resistance or other sources of resistance, or just casting resist elements on yourself, protection from elements on yourself in order to gain this resistance, but this is one way to apply acid resistance to your party for a fight where you need it. There are very few fights that are sort of acid damage themed overall, so I don't think you're going to be heavily in demand for Varsh Boots, so I will say that you can swap them in for one encounter or maybe two encounters in the game and place them in C tier, but they do have a use if you know you're going to take a lot of acid damage. The Vital Conduit Boots. These require medium armor proficiency and give you 8 temporary hit points whenever you cast a spell that requires concentration. So for a cleric, for example, it's probably a choice between a mobility option, the Boots of Striding, and the Vital Conduit Boots. Would you rather have immunity to prone or 8 temporary hit points? 8 temporary hit points is pretty nice. The Vital Conduit Boots will keep you alive in a lot of circumstances where you would otherwise die, because 8 is actually a decent amount of temporary HP to add at the point in the game where you get the Vital Conduit Boots. That could be like a 4th or a 5th of your HP pool, depending on exactly how fast you do it and how much constitution you have and so on. So that can be a significant bonus for keeping you alive. But it is just temporary hit points, and you need to cast a concentration spell to regenerate them, so a lot of characters will only get this effect once in a fight. Notably, the Vital Conduit Boots work on any concentration spell, so if you just want 8 temporary hit points, you can cast a concentration cantrip, like Guidance or Resistance, to trigger them. And they have a special use case for Spore Druids. Spore Druids generate their temporary hit point shield, their Spore Shield, and that's made of temporary hit points, which normally you can't replenish or have temporary hit points from multiple sources. But for Spore Druids in particular in the game right now, there is a bug where when you use the Vital Conduit Boots to gain 8 temporary hit points, that will restore your Spore Druid shield up to its maximum. So you can effectively gain infinite temporary hit points by spamming the Vital Conduit Boots over and over again to restore your Spore Druid shield, keeping it from breaking, keeping your character alive, giving you infinite out-of-combat healing, and so on, just by casting any concentration cantrip. Obviously, that use case is very, very powerful. It's not entirely intended by the game, but the Vital Conduit Boots are super powerful and definitely best in slot for a Spore Druid. Any Spore Druid that's going to be maintain in combat regularly is going to be taking damage to their shield, so the Vital Conduit Boots let them restore that and gain a whole bunch of free healing forever. And then also for other casters, the Vital Conduit Boots are a pretty interesting option. If you have a cleric or any other medium armor caster, the Vital Conduit Boots can give them a pretty nice benefit and keep them alive. S tier for Spore Druids, and still A tier for other casters. And finally, for Act 1 boots, the Watersparkers. The Watersparkers give you, whenever you stand in water during combat, you electrify that water. So you turn it into an electrified water surface, which does 1d4 damage to every creature inside of it at the start of their turns, including yourself. And if you start in an electrified water surface, and that will count the first turn that you turn it into an electrified water surface and then start in it, so this will start from the very first turn of combat, you gain 3 lightning charges. So basically, stand in a puddle, turn it electric, and gain lightning charges. The combination here is with the Sparks Wall ring, which makes you immune to the electrocution effect of standing in the water. So you basically just stack 3 lightning charges every turn for free, as long as you're standing in water, and also make that area of the map hostile to enemies. The Baldur's Gate AI will actually try to avoid electrified water much more than is warranted. It's not really that much damage, but they really do go out of their way to avoid it. So this can be an easy way to protect a caster by having them have the Watersparkers equipped and stand them in a puddle, and then enemies will often avoid them, while they also are building a lot of lightning charges. 3 free lightning charges every turn is a lot of value for free. I talked about how good those are already, increasing your damage, hit chance, and giving you extra damage every time you stack 5, which is very easy to do because you're getting 3 every turn. So you can discharge the effect multiple times per turn, possibly, depending on how many other ways you have to build lightning charges. Lightning charge builds, in general, are going to prefer these to the Speedy Lightfeet. They're just much easier to trigger and give you the same effect. And the Watersparkers overall are just very good. Obviously, you want to use them with the Sparkswall ring to make yourself immune to the effect, but stacking lightning charges increases your damage and is really nice. You do need to build around this effect and have water available either from your inventory or to cast or in the arena already to make the Watersparkers work. So I'm going to give them A tier, but for any character building around lightning charges, these are going to be the core item. So, taking a look at things at the end of Act 1, by the end of Act 1, almost every party, I think, is going to have the Boots of Speed and the Disintegrating Nightwalkers equipped. Then, if you have a character that's built around Reverberation, you'll have the Boots of Stormy, Clamour. If you have a cleric or druid in the party who's not built around the Boots of Stormy Clamour, you'll have the Vital Conduit Boots or the Boots of Striding on that character, and a dedicated healer will have the Boots of Aid and Comfort. More damaging characters will typically have the mobility options, but specific damaging characters can use the Linebreaker Boots or the Watersparkers to excellent effect. Alright, let's talk about the Act 2 boots. Act 2 is pretty interesting for boots because there's only 6 of them. We actually don't get, like, any boot upgrades throughout all of Act 2, but there are definitely some that will come up and be useful as we go. We'll start with the Acrobat Shoes, which unfortunately aren't really one of them. The Acrobat Shoes give you +1 to your acrobatics and advantage on dexterity saving throws. Advantage on dex saves isn't a horrible effect, but it's one that you can get elsewhere from a lot of different things, and most characters will want high dexterity anyways, so dexterity saves are often the least threatening of the saving throws. And dexterity saves, while they're one of the most common types of saves, they're mostly against damaging effects, and usually for half damage, so passing or failing them isn't as impactful as passing or failing, for example, a wisdom save. The Acrobat Shoes could be useful if you know you're going into a fight where an enemy is going to cast a fireball or a lot of dexterity saving throw effects, but honestly you can get this effect elsewhere, and I just don't think it's worth dedicating your entire boot slot to the Acrobat Shoes. You're much better off using a mobility or offensive item. D tier for these. The Boots of Apparent Death. The Boots of Apparent Death let you cast Feign Death once per short rest. Feign Death is a pretty terrible spell. If you have to spend a level 3 spell slot on Feign Death, it's almost never worth it. It makes an ally resistant to all damage, except for psychic damage, but puts them into a coma so they can't do anything. So basically, you stun your ally to give them damage resistance. In normal play, this doesn't do anything. Because you would just never cast this on an ally in combat. It would be much worse than casting Sanctuary on them, for example, in almost every circumstance. But there are some weird uses for Feign Death. Mostly, you can cast it on allied NPCs, so you can use it to keep an NPC who's trying to run into a combat you don't want them in, unconscious for that combat. Very useful in Moonrise Towers, or Last Light Inn, for example, to keep important NPCs alive. And you can also, there is a bug with Feign Death where it doesn't trigger hostility if you cast it on an NPC who's counted as allied to you, and stealing from them while they're unconscious doesn't count as triggering hostility. So you can use Feign Death on a merchant to knock them out and steal all their stuff without getting counted as committing a crime. Now, if you're not abusing that bug, Feign Death comes up in like 2 encounters in the game, but the Boots of Apparent Death are the best way to cast it because then you don't have to actually spend a spell slot on it. So I'm going to give them C tier because you can use them in some specific encounters to keep important NPCs alive. But of course, if you're abusing the bugs with Feign Death in order to steal a bunch of merchant money, then obviously they're better than that. The Boots of Arcane Bolstering. These give you, whenever you dash, you gain 2 turns of Arcane Charge. Arcane Charge increases your spell damage by 2 if an enemy is threatened. It says if you are threatened, it increases your damage by 2, but that tooltip is actually wrong. It increases damage by 2 if the enemy is threatened. This bonus damage applies to every instance of damage that you do, so if you're using like magic missiles, then you can gain +2 damage on all of the magic missiles against a threatened enemy. But for most characters, the Boots of Arcane Bolstering are not going to be useful. Spellcasters don't want to spend turns dashing in combat and if they do, they're giving up a lot of damage because that's an action they're not using. So unless you have bonus action dash, you're not going to trigger it. The characters that get bonus action dash, Rogue and Monk, don't give you bonuses to your spells, so the Boots of Arcane Bolstering won't work for them. However, it's worth mentioning that the Boots of Arcane Bolstering are part of some of the most abusive, theoretical optimization combinations in the game. In order to reach the theoretically maximum one-turn damage in the game, I think the Boots of Arcane Bolstering do feature, and the way that this works is by boosting the damage that every instance of Spike Growth does, because all you have to do to damage an enemy with Spike Growth is move them on it. So if you are using the item that knocks back enemies when you jump, combined with a way to gain free action jumps with Step of the Wind from Monk, combined with bonus action dash from Step of the Wind, and then bounce the enemy across your Spike Growth many times in a turn. I think that's damage that can be in the thousands or tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands. People have been working on this kind of combo with the Boots of Arcane Bolstering. It's part of some of those abusive and dumb combos that won't show up in actual play, but for actual play, there are very few characters that will want to make use of this because spellcasters just don't want to spend their turns dashing. There is one character that can benefit from the Boots of Arcane Bolstering, though, and that is a Magic Missile Wizard, so an Evocation Wizard who has 10 levels in Evocation Wizard, 2 levels of Rogue to gain bonus action dash, can trigger Arcane Charge with the Boots of Arcane Bolstering. That adds 2 damage to all of your magic missiles, and then they're also getting bonus damage from your level 10 Evocation Wizard feature. There are just better ways to boost your magic missiles, but that is a way to do it. So I'll give the Boots of Arcane Bolstering C tier for that specific character, while recognizing that this is also part of a bunch of abusive theoretical optimization combos. The Boots of Brilliance. The Boots of Brilliance let you regain 1 use of Bardic Inspiration. So if you have Bardic Inspiration, you can activate them once per long rest to regain a charge. Obviously useful if you're spending Bardic Inspiration charges. For most Bard characters, there will be better options. You can maybe swap them in and out to gain a Bardic Inspiration charge if you don't mind doing the micro for the Boots of Brilliance. So B tier, Bardic Inspiration's a useful resource. These do take some fiddly usage to gain max value because you'll want to use your inspiration, swap them in, swap them out, etc. But they're fine for characters that are doing that. Mostly, I think, not worth the effort, but if you really want to maximize your value, you can use the Boots of Brilliance. The Dark Justiciar Boots. These are available from a specific story event, and are medium armor requiring boots, so you need medium armor proficiency. Weirdly, unlike almost all the other medium armor boots, these give you +1 to your dex saves, rather than +1 to your athletics. +1 to dexterity saves is better than +1 to athletics, but both are pretty marginal effects. And they also give you the Shadow Teleportation ability. This lets you, as an action, once per short rest, teleport to any obscured area within 60 feet. So it's basically Shadow Monk's teleport, except it requires an action, and it's only usable once per short rest instead of spending key charges for it. For a character that is moving around outside of combat, the Dark Justiciar Boots can be okay. In general, obviously, you're going to be much better off with the Disintegrating Nightwalkers, which do the same thing but without the restrictions and as a bonus action. Spending an action to teleport 60 feet is rarely useful in Baldur's Gate 3, except outside of combat. And outside of combat, you typically have better mobility options. If there is a specific thing that you want to traverse, then the DJ Boots could be good. But for the most part, I think you can safely ignore these. Spending an action to teleport 60 feet just isn't good at this point in the game because you'll have your mobility options sorted out. D tier. And finally, already at the end of Act 2, we have the Evasive Shoes. The Evasive Shoes give you +1 to your acrobatics and +1 to your armor class. +1 to your armor class sounds like a pretty small bonus, but a lot of characters actually just want to gain a passive benefit from their boots. If they don't have a use if they have mobility options already, and so don't need one of the mobility boots, and don't have a specific use for one of these other sets of boots that are a little more dependent on actually what character you're playing and what strategy you're using, the evasive shoes are one of the few ways for characters to just gain a nice passive stat benefit from their boot slot. And so a lot of parties are going to end up equipping them just because they just give you a benefit no matter what character you are. One armor class isn't much, but also lets you hit some thresholds that are kind of important. For example, if you're playing, let's say you're a dexterity-based monk, so you have, in Act 2, 20 dexterity, 16 wisdom, for example, that's 18 base armor class, then you can add 2 to that with the bracers of defense. The evasive shoes bring you to 21 armor class, which is suddenly competitive with heavy armor users. So even that one armor class can get you to the point where you're no longer dragging down your party's average AC, depending on what character you are. If you're like a light armor character or a monk, who will often have lower ACs than the rest of the party at this point in the game, then the evasive shoes can bring you to the point where you're not making it easier for your party to get hit. Typically, you want to raise your lowest AC character's armor so that enemies can't just target them and hit them more easily. So the evasive shoes can help you bring up your party's average armor class, and for that reason are just much better, I think, than they actually look. I think most parties are fairly likely to have a character that can use the evasive shoes, especially if you aren't building around like the Boots of Aid and Comfort or Stormy Clamour, for example. So I'm going to give them S tier because I think a lot of parties will just equip these in order to bring up their average armor class, and that will be a significant benefit for the party. So, at the end of Act 2, I think that most parties are going to end up having equipped the Disintegrating Nightwalkers, the Evasive Shoes, and the Boots of Speed, as well as one of the Boots of Stormy Clamour, Aid and Comfort, or Vital Conduit boots, depending on exactly what your party is built around. You may also have swapped out the Boots of Speed for a more aggressive boots like the Linebreaker Boots at this point, if you have sorted out your mobility options on a character that previously needed them. And moving on into the Act 3 boots, starting with the Blackguard's Greaves. The Blackguard's Greaves are medium armor boots. They give you +1 to your athletics and the effect of Longstrider. Longstrider's a ritual spell, so it doesn't cost you resources to cast it as long as you have it available. And the Blackguard's Greaves don't stack with other castings of Longstrider. Having Longstrider is something that your party should heavily prioritize, so you would only want this if you have a particularly weird party composition that doesn't have access to it. If this just gave you +10 feet of movement, it would be kind of interesting. As is, it's significantly worse than that, and already it's worse than the other mobility boots, and in general, because it's just less mobile than those boots, and it doesn't stack with one of the easiest and most important effects to get in the game. You can ignore these D tier. The Bonespike Boots. The Bonespike Boots give you +5 feet of jump distance, just like the Swiresy Shoes, +1 to your armor class and saving throws if you aren't wearing armor or wearing a shield. So for characters like an unarmored barbarian or a monk, they'll give you an additional AC and +1 to your saves, which is a pretty nice effect. And they give you the ability to use Brutal Leap as a bonus action, which is just an improved version of your jump. It lets you jump, but also if you jump to an enemy, then they have to make a strength save or fall prone. The strength save is based on your item save DC, so weirdly, spellcasters are actually better at knocking enemies prone by jumping on them than martial characters. But the Bonespike Boots just give you a pretty powerful bonus to something that you already wanted to do, which was jump. The Brutal Leap effect is very strong also because it knocks enemies prone for 2 turns. So if you have a way to reduce their movement to 0, like maim or entangling them, then they will be forced to stay on the ground and get stunned. They won't be able to get back up because they'll have no movement to get back up with, so you'll just stun them for an entire turn. And overall, this item is just very solid if you're an unarmored character or if you're jumping a lot. If you're an unarmored barbarian, the Bonespike Boots are going to be best in slot. Now, often barbarians are going to want to be in medium armor, not unarmored, even on into the very late game. But if you're using the Bonespike item set, then the Bonespike Boots are very good. Monks do have a better option in the Boots of Uninhibited Kushigo. Otherwise, the Bonespike Boots would be best in slot for monks. But for an unarmored barbarian or a monk who's more defensively oriented, the Bonespike Boots are going to be very good. I will give them A tier because it's a very powerful effect, but both of the characters that want this item have slightly better options that they're more likely to equip. But the Bonespike Boots are definitely worth keeping an eye on if you think that you want to be knocking enemies prone by jumping on them, and who doesn't want that? The Boots of Persistence. The Boots of Persistence are medium armor, but also give you +1 to your dex saves rather than +1 to your athletics. I'm guessing this is just a database entry error, but I'd be interested if someone has an idea why 3 of the medium armor boots give you a different stat bonus than all of the other ones. If there's some reason for that, that would be kind of neat. I think probably it's just a mistake, but they give you +1 to your dex saves. They also give you Long Strider, just like the Blackguard's Boots, and Freedom of Movement. So, while Long Strider is not a huge bonus, because your character should almost always already have it, Freedom of Movement is pretty nice to just have passively from an item. You become immune to difficult terrain, so you get the effects of the Genial Striding Boots and the Blackguard's Greaves rolled into one, and although those are both weak effects, when you roll them into one, it's a little more interesting, and you become immune to Paralysis and Restrained. Paralyzed and Restrained are 2 of the most dangerous effects in the game, so if you know you're going into a fight where enemies do that, the Boots of Persistence can give you a lot of peace of mind, or just to have them equipped generally, especially if you are a party that doesn't have access to Long Strider for some reason, although you should fix that, then the Boots of Persistence are a reasonable thing to equip. Overall, these give you just enough bonuses that I think they're worth looking at for some parties, so I'm going to give them B tier. Mostly, I think Freedom of Movement on one character is not going to be a tremendous effect, but if you know that that character might get targeted by a hold person or something, like they have a low wisdom save and you're going into a hold person enabled combat, then the Boots of Persistence can be pretty useful for that circumstance. The Boots of Psionic Movement. These are also medium armor boots that give you +1 to your dexterity, so they're the third of them in addition to the DJ boots and the Boots of Persistence that give you +1 dex instead of +1 athletics. But dexterity saving throws, not +1 dex. That would be much better. And they give you, whenever a Githyanki wearer, if you're a Githyanki or disguised as one using Disguise Self, casts Fly, the Fly spell, their next melee weapon attack deals an extra D4 psychic damage. That's a very restrictive thing that requires you to cast a bad spell for a very very minor effect. So mostly that won't come up, except that these also give you the ability to cast Fly as a bonus action. The Fly as a bonus action part works whether you're Githyanki or not, so only the extra D4 of psychic damage requires you to be Githyanki. Fly as a bonus action once per long rest is not at all bad. Obviously, by the time you get these boots, many characters will have Fly from becoming full illithid, but for parties that aren't doing that, the Fly spell is a very good spell, held back mostly by the fact that it costs you a tremendously powerful resource. For characters that get this from an item, it's much, much more interesting, because flight obviously is a very strong effect, even if it's not true flying and is more like hopping in Baldur's Gate 3. Being able to cast it without spending a level 3 spell slot gives you a lot of additional options, and being able to do it as a bonus action instead of an action gives you a lot more flexibility with how you use this effect. It's kind of an upgrade in some ways to the Disintegrating Nightwalkers, because you get your fly movement, which is basically the same as casting Misty Step in a lot of circumstances. Not always, but often, the 60 foot of flight that you get just from casting it immediately will be equivalent to casting Misty Step, and then you continue to get that throughout the rest of the encounter. The problem, of course, is that it does take your concentration to cast it, but overall, Fly as an option for any character that doesn't need their concentration for other things is going to be very good, And while it's once per long rest instead of once per short rest, it gives you a really interesting alternative to the Disintegrating Nightwalkers for a late game mobility option. I'm going to put it in A tier for parties that aren't going illithid. Some characters will still prefer other mobility boots, but the boots of psionic movement are very powerful and definitely worth keeping in mind. The boots of uninhibited Kushigo. These add your wisdom modifier to damage on your unarmed attacks. Obviously, this is intended as a monk item and will let you do double your wisdom modifier to damage if you're an open hand monk, because you get wisdom to damage from your level 6 passive and then wisdom to damage again from the boots of uninhibited Kushigo. These are obviously best in slot for every monk. All monks care about is doing damage, and these are boots that let them do tons more damage. This can be +5, +6, +7 additional damage per attack, depending on how much wisdom you have, and you're a monk, so you're doing tons of attacks in a round, so this is a huge amount of bonus damage. Even if you have lower wisdom, if you're a tavern brawler monk that isn't using elixirs, so had to sacrifice some wisdom to still have reasonable values in all of your stats while hitting 20 strength, the boots of uninhibited Kushigo will still be like +2 damage on every attack, which is, for a monk, amazing, and is definitely going to be best in slot for pretty much every monk out there. It's a damage item for an exclusively damage-focused class, S tier. The boots of very fast blinking. This is one of the possible joke items that you can get, but actually a pretty interesting one for a joke item. The boots of very fast blinking give you at-will Misty Step. You can use it up to once per turn, so if you have multiple bonus actions, you only get to cast it once, but it's completely at will, requiring no resource. At-will Misty Step is obviously an incredibly powerful effect, so the boots of very fast blinking need a correspondingly brutal downside to make them not just best in slot for every character. They do have that, though, because when you use the ability of these boots, you blink, but you leave behind your clothes. When you use the boots of very fast blinking, you drop on the ground at the location where you blinked from, your armor, your helmet, your gloves, and your cloak. So basically every clothing item, and arrive only in your boots and jewelry. Needless to say, I imagine that there is an entire category on AO3 dedicated to this item, and if there isn't, then what are you all doing? Get on it. But the boots of very fast blinking, in addition to being very funny, are actually kind of interesting for a lot of characters. Losing all of your clothing when you blink, all your armor and bonuses, means effectively you're dedicating 5 item slots to at-will Misty Step. You're losing your helmet, gloves, chest, and cloak slots in order to gain at-will Misty Step. For most characters, that's not a great trade-off. But for some characters, actually, that's not totally unreasonable. If you are an unarmored barbarian, for example, at-will Misty Step could be good enough for you to actually use, or if you are a monk, you could actually use this in combat. I wouldn't recommend it, but it would be a kind of fun build to just blink around naked and punch things. And the boots of very fast blinking also give you infinite traversal out of combat. If you take off your clothing and leave it in your inventory before you activate the boots to blink around, then you get to take the clothing with you. It's only if you actually have it equipped that you drop it. So this does just give you infinite out of combat traversal, provided that you're willing to do a bunch of annoying micro by equipping and unequipping your items or picking them up afterwards. That's not terrible in the late game. So in addition to the somewhat dubious combat use of this item, it does have actually quite a lot of out-of-combat utility. I'm going to give it B tier, but only for players who are somewhat patient with equipping and unequipping their items. The Helldusk Boots. The Helldusk Boots make you completely immune to forced movement from an enemy, so they can't push you around with a spell, knock you over, and you ignore difficult terrain. You also get, as a bonus action, once per short rest, you can teleport up to 60 feet. So basically you get a short rest Misty Step, just like the Disintegrating Nightwalkers, but it does a 2d8 fire damage explosion in a 10-foot radius around where you land. So you teleport, you deal a little bit of fire damage in an area. Interestingly, this item has no saving throw, so the fire damage is guaranteed. For the most part, this is better than just casting Misty Step, because you'll blink on top of enemies for a little bit of extra damage, or you can use it to finish off a low health enemy guaranteed. But there are some times where it's a little bit worse if you wanted to blink back to a party member. Mostly, though, that won't actually come up. once per short rest, Misty Step is obviously excellent, regardless of whether it has the riders or not. In addition to that, whenever you fail a saving throw, once per long rest, you can use your reaction to succeed on the saving throw instead. Just being able to say nope to any effect is ludicrously powerful, and for characters that want the Helldusk Boots, which is most characters, often those are going to be characters with a lot of physical damage resistance. Like if you're a melee character who's using the blink aggressively, then the Helldusk Boots will prevent one of the only ways those characters can lose the game, which is by getting hit by a debilitating spell effect, failing the save, and getting knocked out of the fight. The Helldusk Boots give you a whole bunch of stuff all at once. I mean, all the Helldusk items are excellent in Baldur's Gate, and it's no surprise that these are too, giving you an improved version of the effect of the best boots in the game, as well as immunity to difficult terrain and knockback, and the ability to just succeed on a saving throw, making you extremely safe under just about every circumstance. S tier, of course, for the Helldusk Boots. These are going to be your best in slot endgame item for any character that doesn't specifically need another set of boots like the Stormy Clamour ones, for example. The Slinging Shoes. This is a very funny item. They give you +1 to your deck saves, which obviously isn't very exciting, but when you throw them at an enemy, they deal an additional 2d4 psychic damage and then return. They're a returning weapon in the same way that one of the returning thrown weapons is, and like those, they get equipped when you have them returned to you, but because they're boots, they're going to get equipped to your boot slot rather than equipped to your weapon slot. So if you throw these with another set of boots equipped, you're going to be wearing the Slinging Shoes after it. If you throw them while wearing them, then they'll come back and be back on your feet. Because they are a light weapon and a light object without the thrown weapon property, they just use their weight to do damage, and their weight is very low, so they do 1 damage as a thrown weapon, plus 2d4 psychic damage. Obviously significantly worse than throwing an actual weapon that's intended to be thrown. So even for a throwing build, the Slinging Shoes don't actually do the damage that they're supposed to do. This is a joke item and is very funny to use, but in terms of mechanical effect, not particularly exciting. D tier for the Slinging Shoes, although I do love them. The Spaceshunt Boots. These give you no passive effects, but once per long rest, you can cast Dimension Door. Dimension Door is a relatively weak spell in general because it takes a level 4 spell slot, but when you get it for free, it's much more interesting. There are some encounters where being able to Dimension Door yourself and a bunch of other characters around is going to help with those encounters a lot, so you can definitely use the Spaceshunt Boots in certain late-game encounters in Act 3. These items are situational, of course, but useful to swap in if you know you're going to need the mobility. B tier because Dimension Door for free is actually a reasonably powerful effect, though of course you will only equip these if you know you're going to want to cast it. The Tyrannical Jackboots. These give you +1 to your Charisma saves and your Charisma skill checks. As far as I can remember off the top of my head, I don't think there are any enemies that cause you to make Charisma saves in the game. Someone definitely let me know if there's one that I'm forgetting, but Charisma saves are extremely rare, so that won't come up basically ever. The Charisma ability checks, on the other hand, you're still going to be making some of even on into Act 3. By the point in the game where you get the Tyrannical Jackboots, you have very few remaining, but if you really, really want to pass them, then this gives you a way to boost your Charisma checks, and your dialogue skills and whatever, from a slot that can't otherwise do that. So for some very late game dialogue checks that you might want to pass, the Tyrannical Jackboots could theoretically be swapped in. Honestly, this is more micro than I am willing to do, but if you are, more power to you. C tier for the Jackboots because you can use them to pass some late game charisma checks. And finally, the Unwanted Masterwork Greaves, which are only here as a formality because they're mechanically identical to the metallic boots, but are shiny and read as rare and magical in the game. There's no particular reason to pick up these boots. They're just +1 to your athletics check, D tier. Alright, so taking a look at the end of Act 3, the big difference here is that you will have the Helldusk Boots equipped on some character, giving them a ton more defensive options, as well as possibly superseding the Disintegrating Nightwalkers if you only have one character that needed the the ability to cast Misty Step. If you had multiple characters that needed Misty Step, though, you probably just still have both of these sets of boots equipped. If you have a monk, you will have the Boots of Uninhibited Kushigo on them, and a character that needs more armor class will be wearing the Evasive Shoes. Obviously, characters that are specifically spec'd into using the Vital Conduit boots, like a Spore Druid or the Boots of Stormy Clamour, any character that's trying to stack Reverberation will be wearing those, and specific characters that want damage and can trigger them easily will be using the Linebreaker Boots. Characters that may be wanting to jump on enemies may still be using the Bonespike Boots. The Boots of Speed will probably have been rotated out at this point because you just have better mobility options. So most parties are going to end up using something like Helldusk, Nightwalkers, Evasive, and Stormy Clamour, unless you have a character that wants something specifically different. Alright, my friends, I hope that you've enjoyed this look at every boot in Baldur's Gate 3. As always, if you have, feel free to leave a comment and hit like, helps me out with the algorithm. And if you think that there's something that I missed about one of these items, or an item that you would move to a different tier, then definitely do let me know. As always with these, I'm very open to community feedback. We've moved many items around in the past. If you have a good enough argument, or you find something that I've missed as to why we should do so. If you have enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to my channel for more videos like it and other strategy game analysis. And if you really enjoyed the video, then of course you can leave a thank you with the channel membership or super thanks buttons below. And I very much appreciate everyone who does that as well, of course. All right, my friends, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you next time.